We just naturally have minds that think about tidal waves in California where they've never had one in modern California civilization. Can you imagine what a 60-foot tidal wave would do in California? There's nothing physically impossible in having a 60-foot tidal wave in an earthquake zone which California is in. But it's never happened in modern history. But it's the kind of thing that we do think about. And do you think any other company has as much and as rigorous nuclear and so on exclusion as we do?
Well, nobody's attacked it any more vigorously than we've attacked, I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, what you have here is individually, we probably worry more about the downside than just about any manager you can find, and collectively, it's Armageddon around here every day. But that's, we care about that. We've never used a lot of borrowed money. Back when I started out, I mean, I had $10,000, but I just didn't want to borrow any significant amount of money. There's no reason to. We're living fine. We were living fine when I had $10,000, and the idea that you risk what you need and is important to you for something that you don't need and is unimportant is just craziness. And we try to run Berkshire that way. And I had a 98-year-old aunt, my Aunt Katie, that died last year. She had everything she had in Berkshire, and the idea that I should be doing something to try and add a few dollars to my net worth or a few percentage points to the record and be risking the fact that she would go back to Social Security is, I think that's kind of crazy for a manager. But maybe if I had a 2 and 20% arrangement with my Aunt Katie, I'd be differently, but I hope not. My job is to think absolutely in terms of worst case, and to know enough about what's going on in both investments and operations to make sure that no matter what happens, I don't lose sleep that night, over what can, whether there's a 9.0 quake someplace or whether there's a force 5 hurricane that actually goes up the East Coast and enters at places that very seldom does it enter. Long Island, for example, a huge amount of exposure. How often is Long Island going to, really have a major hurricane? Not very often. I think there was one back in the 30s, but there were potato fields there in the 30s, and now there's all kinds of insured value. And everything that can happen will happen. I mean, in terms of what we know of history in this country, last 300 or 400 years, the most severe quake by far was at New Madrid, Missouri. And who would have guessed, that quake would happen? And there were 2 subsequent quakes. They're far enough apart so they didn't exactly seem like aftershocks. All 3 of those were higher than 8 on the Richter scale. Nobody thinks about that, but they've had them in Charleston, South Carolina. You will see things, maybe not in your lifetime, but if you take the centuries, some extraordinary things can happen. And it's Berkshire's job to be prepared absolutely for the very worst. And by and large, I would think hurricanes and quakes are the biggest thing now. But a few years ago, we did not have nuclear, chemical, and biological risks excluded in policies, and we had huge exposure subsequently gotten rid of. But we take on large risks. I'll give you a couple of examples. Just the other day, and nobody else will write this stuff, basically, because they would want to reinsure it with somebody else, and they're not set up to do it. But one large international airport, came to us, and we wrote a policy for $500 million, excess of $2.5 billion from any action that was not caused by nuclear, chemical, or biological sources. So if that airport is taken out in some way, but not by nuclear, chemical, or biological activities, the first $2.5 billion somebody else worries about, and we get the next $500 million. There's a sublimit, so only $1.6 billion can be counted for business interruption. So you would need, and that airport would have to be out for a couple of years to have $1.6 billion of business interruption. So you need $900 million of physical damage on top of that. But somebody is willing to buy that policy, and there's a real risk. We insured the NCAA Final Four down in St. Louis against being canceled, not postponed, or having the games, those Final Four games, moved to another city. But if it was canceled totally, and again, not through nuclear, chemical, or biological, we would have paid $75 million. Same thing, again, not through nuclear, chemical, or biological, we would have paid $75 million. Same thing at the Grammys. I mean, we take on risks that very few people want to write, but in the end, we're willing to lose a lot of money in one day, but we're not willing to do anything that causes us any discomfort in terms of writing checks the following morning. Incidentally, while I'm on the nuclear, while we're talking about the pleasant subjects, I recommended in the annual report that book, Nuclear Terrorism, and if you go to lastbestchance.org, you can obtain, or will soon be able to obtain, a tape free that the Nuclear Threat Initiative has sponsored, which has a dramatization of something that is now fictional, but it's not fanciful. It's something that could happen, in which the Nuclear Threat Initiative is working to minimize the chances of. And on that program, in addition to this dramatization of what could happen in that field, you have Sam Nunn and Senator Lugar with Tom Brokaw discussing the subject. It's an important subject. It didn't get a lot of attention again in this last campaign, although I think both candidates fully recognize the importance. But we would regard ourselves as vulnerable to extinction as a company if we did not have nuclear, chemical, and biological risks excluded from virtually all of our policies, although we intentionally take on the risk periodically, but only in an amount that we feel we can handle. We do not write it and give it away for free, and we do not want to write it promiscuously, because there could be events happen that would make it impossible for our checks to clear the next day, and we're not going to get ourselves in that position. Charlie?
Yeah, we're likely to do better than most other people in dealing with what concerns you. We care more about it, that kind of correlation.
We find when there's trouble, everything correlates, and it's part of my job is to have at least a general idea of the sort of risk that the various enterprises might be running operationally, and then integrate that into my own notion of the risk that we run in terms of investments, in terms of all kinds of things.